Hello class. In this demonstration I'm going to show you how to make stone walls. Perhaps you could use the same concept to make stone floors for site plans or things like that. I am using Illustrator. This is in my attempt to sort of make really nice stylized drawings rendered in Illustrator where you have full control. It's not meant to be photorealistic. Of course, if I was going to do photoreal, I would just use a photoreal rendering engine, as I have showed in other videos. So it's meant to be a little abstracted. It's meant to bring a little style and emotion into the drawing. What we see up here on screen is I actually have a perspective box, and I have a perspective because it's harder than non-perspectives, and I'll talk about in the video. I'll have to do a couple extra tricks because of that. And I have two different kinds of walls. I got sort of a more laid stone on the left. I have more of a rubble wall on the right. At the basic level, they are the same techniques, but in the finalizing details and the joints, they are slightly different. So I'll show both in this video. Really, you can change all the settings any way you want to get a wide variety of stone patterns. If you do want to see the rubble wall, skip ahead to the end of this video. I'm going to start on the left-hand side with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my layers that I've already have set up. I'm going to unlock all the stuff and sort of delete it to get it out of the way and just start from scratch. What I have left with is just lines, and so when I do this sort of Illustrator rendering, I might model in some program and export it as a hidden line. Oftentimes I'll use SketchUp, make it an AutoCAD file, and then I can open that AutoCAD file right here in Illustrator, therefore have these lines be vectors, make them easy to snap to. Whatever way you want to do it, you can get in your lines and build from there. So I'm going to make a layer for the first stone layer, and I'm going to start with a base layer of color. And actually I have already pulled in some colors in my swatches to be prepared for this video. So I'll pull up as needed the color picker. You can pause the video if you need to, write down the numbers, but I encourage you to experiment with your own colors anyway. So I'm going to start with this light gray color and just trace out this whole pattern. And this base layer I'm not going to really do anything to. It's just that the other layers I'll have to use transparencies and blending modes, and so I need a base that has none of that to hold it tight. So what I'm going to do is once I have that applied, I'm going to go to my appearance toolbar and I'm going to make a new fill just by duplicating the existing one. And for this wall, I'm actually going to change my color slightly as I move through just to give it texture and richness. So again, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to set a slightly different gray color. Here's the numbers. Copy it down as needed. And now I'm really going to get to work making my first stone-like appearance. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that this top fill only is selected because I don't want to edit the bottom one. And I'm going to start with stained glass, which is the first step in this effect. And what stained glass is going to do is going to allow you to control the size of these elements here. So, and that's going to sort of start to set up your stone size. So I'm going to start with this here, and of course I've practiced this before. Usually as you're making your own drawings, depending on the size of your building, these numbers need to change, and it does take experimentation, and I don't always get it right on the first try like I do in the video. But here we go, I've added the stained glass here. I'm going to select the same fill, and the second main part of this effect is to apply sponge to it. So when I apply sponge, you can start to see what it's doing is creating like a shadow-like effect. So I'm going to go with almost these numbers I have up on your screen, just change it slightly to get it a little more effect like this. And you know, that's a good effect there. Now you might go with this. Another sort of tweak you could play on it, and I do sometimes, but sometimes don't, depending on the detail I want, is you could add the craquelure effect. I think I'm saying that correctly. Here we can see that makes it sort of look a bit three-dimensional in that way. So I will just adjust these numbers slightly. I don't know that they have much effect, but it gives it a bit more of a three-dimensional look when I do that. And I want to reduce sort of the strength of all of this. So I'm going to change my blending mode and transparency to multiply in something around 50%. Doesn't have to be exact, but looks like I nailed it on that time, just to sort of soften it up a little bit. And so there's a start of some shadows of the stones is really what we're going for here. And what I'm going to do is, oftentimes when I'm doing stonework, I need at least a second one of these. So I'm just going to duplicate this whole layer. It's going to make it stronger in this case. And what I want to do is, I usually only want to use the craquelure on one, so I'm going to delete the craquelure right away. That's what I find works. You might work it another way, but most importantly, what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to change the color ever so slightly again. Sort of make it a little tan to just bring some more color into this. I'll pull up the color picker here. There you go, so you can see the numbers. But the key is I actually want to change the size of the stained glass so it doesn't overlay the same shadows exactly as before. And so since the last one was pretty small, I think I'll have to make this one a bit larger. So go to 22 to make it larger. And then what often is the case that'll have to happen is when you change the stained glass size, you also want to change the sponge size as well to accommodate it. So I'm just going to make some minor tweaks to this thing. Doesn't matter quite as much probably, but you know, a little bit always helps. So we'll let that run. So now we can see I've got shadows at different sizes, and I will also change different opacity settings. So I'm going to just actually raise this up a bit to get those shadows a bit stronger into there and get a richness of stonework. Now, one thing you can do, and this is completely optional based on what you want to do, I can add a bit more detail to this by going to this fill and applying a texture and a grain to this. You'll see what this does here. It might take a step or two to fully show through. What I want to do is you want to change the grain type to clumped, and you know the settings is probably okay there. I might reduce it just a little bit, something like that, and let this run. At first it looks a little spotty like that, but watch what happens when I now pull this grain to the top of all of those filters within this fill. What it does is it turns each essentially stone-like piece into a different color. Now, right now it's still two colored. I could play with different blending modes and other things to change that. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do it by adding one more fill type. So I'm going to duplicate this fill. And I'm going to take out this grain. Let it run here. There we go. And I'm actually going to change the blending mode from multiply to color. And we can see now it's taken all those colors and instead taken those tones and just turned it into the tones of the same color, which of that tan color I have above. So I have some darker stones and some lighter stones. But I can actually take this a step further. You might be happy with that and you might want to move on. But what I'm actually going to do is, so another option here, and then actually instead of applying it all to the stone level, I want to get some, since this is a big wall, I want to get some contrast across the wall itself. And so to do that, I'm going to apply a few other effects. In fact, I'm not going to use sponge at all, and I'm going to change my stained glass and make it larger to make big moves across the entire wall. So let me open up stained glass here, set this all the way up to like 44, and maybe even add a little bit of light to it there. Say okay. This is going to take a couple fills to make this work. So, but you can start to see it's got some edges there, and so I'm going to go to Effect, I'm going to go to Artistic, I'm going to go to Cutout. And do something like this so I get some tans, some lights, some darks, richness like that. I'll say OK. You can start to see it sort of applying splotchiness across it. And you might be happy with that. You can also, again, completely optional, I could come into here and go to Distort and maybe run something like Ocean Ripple. And what this is just going to maybe blur those areas a bit so you can see the effects that it sort of has on there. I'll up that a little bit and say OK. And so I sort of blurred out the edges, and we have richness at different scales across the wall, at a bigger stone level, at a sub level, and all these things are sort of layered up on top of them. Again, you might not need all these layers if you don't have it so prominent on your screen. If it's just a little piece of your drawing, you can get away with fewer of these. Now, the really important step here is to do the joint work, and the different stones they showed at the beginning really applied the joint works differently. So I'll get into that now, and I'm going to start by just making a new fill. Now all this fill that's all like the color and the shade and the shadow of the stones itself, so it's a completely new fill. So I'll just hit the new fill button just to start from scratch here, and it's just going to apply this gray tone over across my entire drawing, and I'll leave that for now. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and pull up a new swatch. I've actually have it loaded in, but I've custom made a swatch. It's more than a color, so I want to show you how to do that. So I'm going to go to Swatch Library. If that's cut off my screen a little bit, that Swatch Library there, and I'm going to go to Patterns, and I'm going to go to Basic Graphics and Basic Texture Graphics here, and I've made my icons larger so we can see them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this one here, which is called Lines. All right, and I'm going to start by drawing a box up in the zone up here just so we can see what happens. And it's drawing these set of lines right here that sort of looks like they could be stones. Very abstracted, but again, that's my goal. If you are familiar with AutoCAD and you have a particular hatch pattern you've been doing, because you can download different stone hatches for AutoCAD, you could also just do that. You could bring that hatch pattern into Illustrator and basically do the same steps I'm going to do now with that hatch pattern to make a sort of joint pattern that you want. But I figured I'll stick with Illustrator for this sort of demonstration and use this one here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get access to these lines. So I'm going to go to Object and Expand and just expand this out. And what that's going to allow me to do is it sort of became a group and a set of objects. So I need to double click on this a couple times. And when I get to the right spot, like right here, I can get the original hatch or the original thing that's set up. See, when I got just that one square that's smaller than the rest, I have it. So I'm just going to Control C or Edit Copy to copy that. And I can actually delete this out of the way. And I can Control V to paste it. Oop, to paste it in, I selected the wrong object there. Let me undo that. I actually don't need this palette anymore, so let me get rid of that. So I'm just going to move this back up here because I want to make some edits to this. It's not going to be great if I use it as is, which is why I'm going through all these steps. So I'm going to ungroup this just to get them back to their objects. And I know just from practice that the line weight of this is really small. You can see it's 0.3. I'm going to want it larger than that, so I'm going to set it to be 1. Now the issue is when I set it to 1, these lines are all bleeding into each other, so I need to fix that. So I'm going to select all these objects, and I'm just going to pull them down till the lines are spaced apart about where I think looks good, so maybe somewhere like that. Now once I have that, I'm going to make this into a new swatch. So I'm going to go to my swatch panels, just have this all selected, and drag and drop this in right over here, and it makes a new swatch that I can apply. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pull this off to the side just in case I need it again. Maybe I made a mistake somewhere, so we'll just keep that in case I need it. But I'm going to go now to this object here that I've been working on, to this fill that I just made that's all gray. I'm going to change the fill to the fill I just made. And there's going to still be a few edits we're going to have to make to this. So one is we can see the stone pattern is probably too large. So what I'm going to do is you can change swatch size on things like this. And you can do that by going to your scale tool. You do have to use the scale tool and not the arrow tool or the select tool. And I'm going to come and I'm going to hold tilde on my keyboard. That's the key below escape and above tab, the little squiggly mark. I'm going to hold tilde. I'm going to just click and start dragging. When I see just a box that's not the size of my shape, that means I've got it. And if I make it smaller, it's just going to make this pattern smaller. So we'll let that run through. And I'd say maybe a little bit smaller I could go. So we'll try just a little bit smaller. We'll see how this looks. And there we go. We'll see. Okay, that's good. That's a good start. Now, of course, this is why I did the perspective, is this pattern was great for elevation, it might be great for a plan, but it doesn't work in perspective because the horizontal lines need to go to the vanishing point. So I've got a great trick for doing that too. What I'm going to do is actually first going to add grain to this. I'll tell you why, because my perspective tool only works if there's a filter already applied to it, a Photoshop filter effect applied to it. So I'm going to go do this. I like to add this effect anyway. I'm going to go to artistic. I'm going to go to film grain. And I'm going to set up 1410. Looks pretty good. Yeah, 1410.5. I think that'll be good, and I'll say OK. You can see this just makes it so it's not so like an ink line. There's a little bit of inaccuracies and stuff in it. And it looks less strong now because I need to put multiply on it because there's white dots in it that are obstructing our view, but once I use multiply, those will go away and the strength will come back, but not quite as strong as before. So now that I got this one film grain in it, what I can do is I can come back to this and I can use my little perspective trick, which is under warp, and it is bulge. And this again is going to take a few moves to get correctly right, but it's the first step. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that my bend is set to 0 because I don't want to worry about bend. What's going to do all our perspective work is this horizontal distortion, and I know because I practiced that 25% is right. That's going to match mine. And we don't see it at first. I practiced this so I know 25 is correct. You're just going to have to set a number at first and say OK. Because we can see all it's done is it sort of changed the whole shape of it. It hasn't actually changed the perspective of my object. The reason for that is it's going to put it above your film grain or what filter you use. And I need it below. As soon as I pull it below that filter, it's actually going to do it to the whole object itself, or the effect itself, and it'll go into perspective. And we can see now that my horizontal lines are going towards the vanishing points, but my verticals are perfectly straight, which is good in perspective. Now, if you need to go and change the warp because you need to see the effect, you just open it again and change the numbers and say OK, and it'll come along. Now, the other issue is because of the bulge, it has taken it away from these points and made it too large here. So it's going to take a couple effects to fix that. I'm going to go to effects for the first one. Oops, I did not mean to click that. I apologize. Let this run here and I'll cancel it out or undo it. Don't need a crop. Undo crop marks. Sorry about this little pause here in the video, okay? Because what I meant to do is go to Distort, Transform, and go to Transform, because I'm just going to make this whole object bigger. Ultimately, I'm going to need a clipping mask because it's already popping out down here, so I might as well just make it big enough that it pops out everywhere so that it fills the entire space, and because of the warp, it'll still be in perspective. So I know 120 works for me. In this drawing, you'll have to set it as you want. Uh-oh, I did it to the whole object. So that's because I did the crop and I had to undo. I just need to pull this transform, in my case, to below the warp. If you didn't misclick like I did, I should have been fine, but you know what happens. So there we go. So now it's just being applied to the stones. Now the stones got bigger because that transform effect made it bigger. I could make it smaller the same way again. I'm going to leave it for now because I'm going to show you another trick that's purely optional as we sort of move through this. But right now I do want to get rid of all the work sort of across on the edges here. So what I'm going to do that, I'm going to have to use a clipping mask. Go to transparency. I'm going to make mask. Of course, it's all going to disappear once it sort of loads up in here, which is perfectly fine. I'm going to click on this square to get to my mask. I'm going to set my color to pure white, and I'm just going to trace out this wall again so that anything that's white will be shown. So all that work is going to be shown in here. As I move around, and what's going to be left out is anything outside of that boundary. So I've got rid of all those exterior lines that I didn't need, but I've got this in perspective, or pretty close to in perspective there. Good enough for a drawing like this. I could argue that I need to squeeze it a little bit more and up that bulge, but I don't want to waste too much time in this video. So I'll jump back to my regular object, you might call that good and you like that. If you want a little more detail, here's another option. I'm actually just going to take this fill, that's all the lines, the joint work, and I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm basically going to keep everything the same except for I'm going to change the size of just this to get another richness of level in the joint work. So I'm going to go to scale, I'm going to hold down my tilde key, and I'm going to make it smaller. And you might have to play with the sizes of this again. We'll see how this works. Right now it's all aligned, so it has a sort of weird effect to it, but I can also move it, the hatch, in the same way, or the fill in the same way. So I need to go to select my black arrow, still hold down tilde, and just move it to a new position. And once I've done that, we can start to see that that adds a sort of almost randomness to the stone pattern. And honestly, I could keep playing with this. I could move it, I could scale it. I think it still needs to be moved a little bit. I think it needs to be scaled a little smaller, but I think it looks pretty good, and you get the point for this demonstration. You might also play with some transparency if you want to lighten up those joints a little bit, but there's 100 ways you could play with all these things to get what you want. So I think I showed you the skills on this piece. So let me jump over and to the other wall to show you how to do the rubble wall. Actually, before I show the rubble wall, I just want to make one point really quick. I'd already sort of made a window layer, and if you have anything, windows, trims, doors, whatever the case might be, just draw those on a layer on top. So I'm just going to quickly pick a dark color to make this window, which should have different reflections or gradients or something in it. But the point is, if I put it on the layer above that stonework, it just blocks it out. I don't have to worry about cutting out holes for those things. Makes work a bit more simpler. So I did that. For this other stone, I'm going to just make a new layer, and I'm going to start out basically the same way. I'm going to use slightly different colors. So I'm going to use a tanner color here. Here's the numbers for it, and I'm going to trace out the wall as I did before. And again, I'm going to start very, very similarly to the way I did the other stone. And that is by making first stained glass. In this case, I'm going to go fairly large for these stones to make each stone sort of seen as is. And then just like before, after stained glass, I'll follow it up with sponge. And when you change these numbers, you do have to change sponge usually. So now we can see even with that alone, I start to get almost like rock patterns pretty clearly shown in there with the joints as well. But just like before, if I add more fills to this, I can get slightly more richness, and it all depends on the level of detail you need to. So I will do that. I'll go ahead, make a new fill, and actually what I want to do is I want to take these two objects, I want to make sure they're inside this fill, and I'm going to delete this fill because I want to copy it exactly. That was my mistake again. So I have these filters inside this fill with the drag and drop, and just duplicate all of that again. Because the reason why I want to do that, because a lot of these things will be similar. It already has stained glass, but again, I want to change the size because I want to give it different sizes of shadows and things of that nature. So I'm going to change the size and make this one smaller in this case, and equally change. Actually, the sponge size. I think I can leave the same. It looks good. I'll just leave it the same. But what I do want to do is I want to change the blending mode so that they blend together. I'm going to experiment with darken in this case and change the opacity to something around 50% probably. Yeah, that'll be good. So there we go. We can start to see the different layers starting to interact and mingle together. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to take this bottom fill again, and I'm going to duplicate it. Now this might be good enough for you. I'm going to add some more to it, just add subtle effects, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do like I did on the other wall and add a grain to it to give some more richness of color in things. So I'm going to select this fill, go to Effects, Style, Texture, Grain. Again, what I used is I used clumped, so select it to clumped if you need to, and just change these numbers a bit to make it a bit brighter. And when this comes in, it's going to come as little dots, but watch what happens. I'm going to pull this grain just up within the same fill, but to the top. And when I do that, each stone becomes a color, right? So it sort of gives each effect. Now, obviously, stone doesn't have to be that color, although some stone does have a lot of color to it. And so, you play with the color of the fill, play with the grain, you can really get it to your advantage. In this case, I'm going to really soften it a bit by changing the opacity way down. So that it just has a very subtle shift in tones and colors for each of those stone patterns there. Now that's the basic of rubble. Now I need to do the joint lines of this rubble, okay? And that's going to be completely different than the other stone pattern. In fact, in this case, because of the way I'm going to have to use a clipping mask that I find works best, I'm going to have to make it as a completely separate object. So I'm going to click off of that stone pattern, and I'm going to set my fill color to black. And I'm going to just trace out this wall, the same shape. And actually, what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to cheat for a second. I'm going to delete this. I got to do one step first because I'm going to need this for the mask, or at least this is going to be the easier way to do the mask. I'm just going to select this stone, and I'm going to Control-C to copy it to my clipboard or edit copy. I don't need it right now, but I am going to need it for when I do the mask. You'll see as we move forward. So I'm going to set my fill to black again. I'm going to click around this shape. My joints are going to be a dark color in this case. If you want to have your joints be a lighter color, just choose a different color in this step. Sometimes you have darker stones with a light gray mortar, and that would be the case that you want to go. And so it's just a matter of setting your color at this stage to what you want it to be. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a mask for this guy. And I'm going to move over to mask mode. Right now it's all black, it's all blacked out, so we see the original object here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in front, Control F. You can do it under edit as well, to get the original stones paste right in front. And we can see what it's going to do is, since it has a variety of tones right now, it sort of makes it this awkward set of colors. But now I can just use these because I want the joints to match that stonework, so that's why I need the same sponge and stained glass and all this. But I don't need all the richness and textures and things. So I can just select the first two fills and just trash can them, delete them right out of there. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a couple new effects to this to make sure that I get this object to be purely black and white, so I can make the clipping mask, so I can mask out the stones but keep the joint work. So to do that, I'm going to run a couple effects. The first one I'm going to do is cutout. So that's under artistic. I'm going to go to cutout. I'm going to have to definitely change these numbers. I think that'll work. So we can see it's starting to be like, oh, there's the stones and there's the joints. So it's starting to have an effect. And then the last thing I need to do on here is I'm going to go to Sketch, and I'm going to go to Chart, Chalk, and Coal, and set this way up 2025. That looks like we see we got black and white. So it's going to get rid of black, keep the white, which of course we have to remember the white in this case is going to be the base layer, which is colored black. But there you go, right? So the point is the white is what's being seen through the layer. So now I see the joints and I see the stones and I have this rubble look. I would say these joints are still too dark, so I'm going to click back over to normal mode, normal drawing mode. I'm going to change the opacity down to whatever might work, and there we go. There is the rubble look right there. So two ways of doing stones. They are basically based off the same concept, stained glass and sponge. You layer up different fills, you have different ways of doing joints. Really, there's lots of things you can do. You can play with all of those settings. Settings will be up to you in your drawing and your drawing size and what you're trying to accomplish. Same with colors, and come up with your own ways of doing stones. This is just a guide to sort of get you there so you can go make great drawings. All right, get to it, and I will see you in the next video.